Hello and welcome to Executive Tech Talks, the show where we talk to executives about their technology tribulations and triumphs. Thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, our sincerest thanks to this episode's exclusive sponsor. And now, here's your host, Johna Johnson, who will introduce today's guest.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you all, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Tom Doughty. Tom is the CISO of Prudential. I'm so happy you could be here today to talk about zero trust security. Welcome, Tom. Let's start with the definition of zero trust security. So, Tom, how do you define zero trust?
I would apply a modern definition of zero trust more or less as follows. It's less trust. It's asymptotically approaching zero, but it's about endpoints and user experience that are not dependent upon being tethered to either what's on that endpoint or, more importantly, anchored back to a touchstone that's a data center, traditional colo, etc.
So I really like the asymptotically approaching, and I have to say I'm smiling because I've heard that before, and I think it's a good way to look at it. Another way we like to look at it is a distributed network of highly granular trust allocation and revocation. So the notion that something is trusted for once and for all time because it's inside the perimeter goes away.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is about granularity to a degree, but I also don't think that it's a dichotomy between trust and not trust. I really think of this, and I like the term conditional access in many ways more than I like the term zero trust.
While we're still on definitions, I have to ask, to what extent do you and would you recommend that other financial services firms rely on the NIST architecture and definition of zero trust?
You know, it's an interesting question. I think that the NIST framework stands up left to right in all 5 components. But what we cover down on, there are a lot of implications in terms of particularly the way I look at it, detect and respond, that are a little bit different when you get to a true zero trust environment. So what do I mean by that? I look at some of the challenges that we have, even in a traditional environment sometimes, in terms of things like log management, forensics, things that in the legacy infrastructure, if you will, ostensibly you'd think, well, it's easier to understand, be able to operate within that framework. And when you get to a point where by design, you're not relying upon managing some of those endpoints and environments, does it challenge those? Yes, it challenges them. But if you think about it long term and think of it in an objective oriented way and not a try to shoehorn specific tasks into the NIST framework in that example way, things should get better, right? Because on one hand, there's less that you have to worry about. Do I really care to the same degree about things going on, let's just say at the operating system level or services level on an endpoint, if I'm not relying upon them in a streaming services, streaming app, streaming platform environment, especially if it's not a full node on our network? And the answer is yes, there's less dependence on it. But some of the challenge I see swinging the needle in the other direction, even before enterprises, including Prudential, get to the full end state, if we ever get there, that we define around zero trust, is what's the right data? Did you really think about, not as an ad hoc patchwork, but as a designed mosaic, where do we need visibility? It's about collecting the right data, not all of the data, and that translates into day-to-day operations from a monitoring and the CSOC perspective all the way toward forensics when we need it at the endpoint.
It sounds like you're really recommending kind of a NIST prime or NIST tweak rather than a full-on, let's, just take the platform, architecture off the shelf and deploy it.
But I think it's execution within the framework as opposed to the framework doesn't apply.
Right. Okay. And then the next question that comes up from what you were talking about there, you were talking a little bit about data and visibility. It seems to me from working with clients that one of the biggest challenges to implementing zero trust is having an accurate inventory of what your environment looks like. Would you agree with that?
One of the things I'm really focused on in terms of how to try to explain this to non-technical people or to business stakeholders is the idea that an attacker doesn't know our risk taxonomy. An attacker doesn't know our asset inventory, what's included in our CMDB, what our surface area really consists of between affiliates or core pieces of our business, etc. So how we think about this should follow suit, at least in large part, in terms of our programs. So asset management remains, yes, critically important. And I think whether most organizations think they're good at it, most organizations are not good enough at it. So I think you have to do both. I think that continuing to try to improve CMDB, improve asset management, and it's more of a challenge sometimes at the component level. People think they have a good handle on their endpoints, their applications, but not necessarily all the contained services, components, open source drips and drabs within their applications. That to me represents the challenge in CMDB that attackers take advantage of. So what does that mean in the context of zero trust? At the end of that path, if there is an end to this path, I think what it means, at least in large part, is there are fewer moving pieces that we depend upon at the endpoint in particular, or in legacy infrastructure footprint, that we care about in terms of CMDB in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily net easier, it's just different. There are now different pieces of surface area in terms of what I think of as the connective tissue between software-defined services, cloud-based services, etc., that by design are not tied back to our legacy data center environment, but represent new pieces of configuration that we need to worry about. And I think a lot of people are not thinking about those interchanges between external services as something they need to look at in their CMDB. They're assets now, and they weren't considered assets before.
I'm going to pause here since we've talked about some of the challenges, and I want to circle back. Let's first take a quick break for a word from our sponsor.
A pause for a word from our sponsor. Recognizing that security functionality must be fully integrated into the network, AI-driven SD-WAN powered by SessionSmart has built-in security that ensures that sessions are delivered based on identity and context to relevant parties following real-time security policies. This solution ensures that a modern, cloud-centric digital business can provide secure access to users and devices anywhere, and gives you the flexibility to configure your WAN and LAN networks to your specific security needs. A quick disclaimer. This third-party advertisement does not constitute an endorsement, guarantee, warranty, or recommendation by Executive TechTalks, Nemertes, WSTA, today's guest, or their company. We make no representations or warranties about any product or service advertised. With that, back to our show.
And some of the challenges that other organizations that I've worked with have is they pay lip service to zero trust, but when it actually comes down to spending money, there's a sudden request for, well, show me the tangible benefits I'm going to get from this. How would you recommend they look at quantifying those benefits?
The question's a good one. And I think when we look at this, not just from the security perspective, but from the IT management perspective and from the architectural perspective, how do you sell that to business stakeholders? Why should we bother? Well, I would observe that we really never went and sold to business stakeholders the idea of zero trust as part of a standalone package. You sell the idea as a component of what does the new environment look like in terms of tie-ins to what's in their interest. Okay, yes, let's be plain about it. There are some longer term and ongoing run rate cost savings to not being in the data center business anymore. There's flexibility in terms of services we can use and leverage without backhauling, without latency. So from that perspective, it's like anything else when I tend to look at things from the negotiation 101 perspective. If I didn't believe in it myself, or if our CTO or CIO didn't believe in it ourselves, well, we wouldn't be trying to sell it. But the idea of what is in Prudential's interest from the business stakeholder perspective, and by extension our shareholders and our customers, some of the talk tends to be not about technical deliverables, but about things like what do users spend their time on? What are users distracted by that's not core to what they need their compute experience and their interaction with the applications to be? And particularly in some of the customer-facing roles where they're not necessarily at the same location all the time, dependencies upon static conditions are not a positive. And the degree to which we can minimize that is a positive. And when articulated as in those terms, along with an overall package of no data center business anymore, no data center operations anymore, ability to pivot between emerging external solutions without that technical debt more nimbly. That's how you sell it. I don't think you ever go in and say, I'm going to sell zero trust uniquely or on a standalone basis.
I would certainly second that. We've actually been doing some research into zero trust technology, and one of the things we found is that most folks would say it enables their digital transformation. It is strategic to work from home, which you touched on as well, or more importantly, hybrid work from anywhere. And operationally, what it tends to deliver is much higher user satisfaction right off the bat. Users are much happier, and many fewer individuals involved in provisioning user access, which is actually a really big deal.
Yeah, it's about the experience working from home. But when we get to the new normal, which for many people will be as
hybrid
needed or sprinting hybrid, a day or two a week in the office in many cases, the other days wherever they may be, it's about making that experience consistent. It is not consistent when you're working from home versus in the office. There are additional steps that are my fault because I'm the security person in terms of identity and access management and MFA, et cetera, that if you knock rough edges off them, and it really doesn't matter, are you in the office, are you in the airport lounge, are you home, people frankly like that. There are fewer variables to go wrong a few times during their year for the typical user, and it wastes less of their time.
Well, what advice would you have for someone who is either just launching their zero trust journey, so to speak, or is moving along it but not as far as they'd like to be? What would your sort of top 3 recommendations be?
The first is that you can't look at this as a security discipline. It's looked at as a security question. It's sold as a security question, and there are certainly security imperatives to this in modern architecture. But if you're not knee deep in this with a collective architecture function and whatever equivalent of a CTO that you have who's actually going to engineer and execute against this, that's responsible for delivering the infrastructure for your enterprise, it's probably going to be a case in point where you look back and wish you did that earlier. So I would say do exactly that. This has to be an integrated view of what's your 3 to 5 year architectural strategy and infrastructure strategy as opposed to a security initiative. The other is that I always ask the questions why and so what, and they're not facetious, because if you run out of answers to that, what are you doing, right? So who are you doing this for? We touched on it. Well, we're doing it largely for the end users because the end users are the lifeblood of what we do. So if we're not thinking about this upfront from the application modernization perspective, which and then the why and so what to application modernization is, what is the business function trying to accomplish? Business footprints are changing too. Business focus in terms of what we're trying to provide and solve for our customers changes. And if we solve for today's or design for today's questions or deliverables in that sense, and it takes us 2 to 3 years to deliver those and didn't figure out that the business footprint in terms of what they're trying to accomplish is a little bit different down the road, then we're constantly playing catch up. So let's face it, we're always playing catch up to some degree in this endeavor of ours that we call security and call architecture and infrastructure management in general. But that idea of business stakeholders, what do you need and want the user experience to be? What is your footprint of activities going to be? What services do you think you're going to try to deliver? Those are all inputs to architecture. And it just goes back to the idea that you can't do this yourself. This cannot be designed by your security architects or engineers along with your network engineers. And
so I'm going to leap in.
Architecture standpoint.
I'm going to leap in on that because you've talked about a handful of stakeholders that need to be involved. I think the one you haven't hit on but we've discussed is also the operations folks. Because if you start answering those questions, why and so what, one of the answers has to be, we're going to make your lives easier and better, which means the operations people have to be bought into that.
I'm glad you brought that up because that human capital viewpoint on that has to be proactively included, and it doesn't happen organically. It's reskilling, it's knowing what new skills do you need to bring in. It's also that question of, and I'll be plain and say we face in some cases, because of some of the long tenures, there are a lot of strong relationships. and being able to break some of the cycles of, okay, we've reorganized, we've reskilled, we've reassigned, we've added some new responsibilities, we've eliminated some old ones. By the way, you have to decide what you're not going to do anymore on a timely basis, but also break some cycles of you plan and resource for the efficient, strategic mix of tasks that you think you need to perform. But if you're still hanging on to some of the old stuff, you're not going to make it.
Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. Very much appreciate your insights on zero trust and how to enable that zero trust journey. And again, many thanks to today's sponsor. The information is linked below. Please have a look. Thank you so much.